So welcome everybody to the next event in the Architectures of Transition series. And this is a series that's focused on how architecture can and has participated in epochal change. Obviously, this was problematic in the transition into industrial society, but it's also full of flexibility in the transitions to come. We're going to have two more events in the series. The next is a two-part lecture workshop event with design theorist Tony Fry. The title of that event is called The Other Architecture. And then that's going to be on March 30th and April 6th. It's a two-part event. So the first part is more of a lecture, the second part is more of a workshop. And then we have another event by the ABI Collective, which is a newly formed coalition that is trying to activate people that work in the built environment as a political constituency. So members of that include the Architecture Lobby, Science for the People, and a couple other activist organizations. Also, I have to say that there's a symposium next weekend that's associated with the exhibition downstairs. That's on April 1st. It is an all-day event. There's information on the website. It's called Order, the Spatial Ideologies of Carbon Modernity. But let's go back to tonight's event, and let me introduce our speakers. We have here today with us the honor of having Brittany Utting and Daniel Jacobs, also known as DJ. If I refer to him as DJ, that's why. And they have an office called Home Office. And let me introduce them individually. Brittany is an assistant professor of architecture at Rice University and co-founder of the research and design collaborative Home Office. Her work looks at the relationship between architecture, collective life, and environmental care. She previously taught at the University of Michigan. She was the Willard A. Overdyk Fellow. And currently she's editing the volume Architectures of Care, which is part of a symposium that she organized, or it's the kind of outcome of that.
The aftermath.
The aftermath, exactly, which is a fantastic symposium. It's still online, right?
Yep.
I recommend everyone to look that up. So it's called Architectures of Care, from the Intimate to the Common. Fantastic event. Daniel Jacobs, DJ, is an instructional assistant professor in architecture at the University of Houston and also co-founder of Home Office. His research and writing centers around the labor, production and material ecologies of the built environment. He has previously served as the secretary of the National Organizing Committee of the Architecture Lobby. He taught as a lecturer at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, and also practiced as an associate at Shop Architects. He's a registered architect. Well, so are you.
Yes.
Both are registered architects. They know how to make architecture. It's very important. And so I just want to say also that they'll be presenting work from their firm, Home Office, which is a research and design collaborative that explores the reciprocity between architectural types, technical assemblies, and their environment. I think they have a really exciting practice. I don't know if everyone else is really working in the way that they are. So I'm really pleased to have them here tonight. Help me welcome Brittany and DJ.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the intro. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Before we begin, we just really wanted to thank Lisa and the Cooper Union for hosting us. It's an amazing honor to be part of the Architectures lecture series and at this sort of really critical conversation happening right now. So thank you so much. So in the context of the Architectures of Transition series, we're interested in using this talk as an opportunity to imagine how architecture can function as a sort of time machine for a future climate. So to unpack that idea, we're interested in this notion of transition and how it poses a temporal problem. First, how to get from point A, the carbon spike of the Anthropocene, to point B, a more just climate future, and what happens in the space and time between these 2 points, or the present. This conception of the present as a transition or interpolation between 2 points recognizes the coexistence of multiple timescales, from the entanglement of deep geological time with fossil capital today to new deals that reimagine our relationships to the environment and its resources. So radically, these timescales collapse into our messy present, which suggests a possible methodology for transition that combines the pragmatism of incremental change with the imaginaries of a more speculative climate future. So in this sense, we argue that architecture can function as a sort of time machine, roving forward and backward through time to observe our disturbed environments, their ghosts, their potentials, and through that project a possible path forward. So tonight we're going to present a series of research and design projects that hopefully operate along this timeline of transition in different ways, from looking at transformations of the suburban landscape to reimagining architecture as an instrument for observing and mediating environmental change. So
the first project we're going to talk about is called Model Homes, which proposes an alternative developer catalog for the suburb, imagining new typologies that rescript the familiar forms of the home. As a series of models, drawings, financial analyses, and slogans, the Catalog of Homes is perhaps the most prolific author of the American suburban landscape. It typically describes each model through a stylistic narrative, coupled with a standardized floor plan. Each model's name is meant to appeal to a consumer archetype with an architectural style, such as the Sears homes, like the Cape Cod number 13354A, 13354B, the Chateau number 3378, and the Milford number 3385. The name's tone is nostalgic, but at odds with the numerical designation of each model. The pragmatism of the list reveals the underlying device at work. The catalog co-opts the narratives of the home to camouflage its mechanisms of financialization, debt, and property.
So the plan of the single-family model home often reflects the resident's familial structure, its gender divisions, internal hierarchies, economic status, and relationship to a property through the redundancy of spaces and specializations of rooms. So this diagram house organization from the 1970 Book of Standards Architects Data, Ernst Neufert graphs the spatial orders of the home from a single room to a multi-staffed household. This org chart transforms the home into a series of branching rooms, materials, and inventories, making visible the increased privatization and infrastructural redundancies that come with wealth and status.
So as a counter project, Model Homes proposes 138 new models, reimagining the logics of Neufert's org chart to represent alternative forms and practices of everyday life. Conceptualized as an alternative developer catalog for the suburb, each type simplifies the diagram of the home into the most intimate conditions of daily life: eating, sleeping, bathing, working, relaxing. The reduction of the home into a series of generic rooms creates housing typologies that can accommodate new modes of cohabitation, social forms, and kinship structures. While the home has historically been used to produce or transform socio-political status, family structure, privacy norms, gender, can a reconfiguration of these rooms make a space for additional modes of subjectivity not currently provided for in the housing market? For instance, how can the simple elimination of the hallway undermine the maintenance of privacy? How does the removal of the private kitchen from the home open up spaces for collective use and negotiation? Can the multiplication and redundancies of space for leisure or labor create new patterns of occupancy and use within the home? How could the sharing of boundaries challenge conditions of property, landscape, access, stewardship, and consensus?
So laying bare the mechanisms of the home, these transformations result in the reprogramming to produce new forms of life that reimagine the conventions and subjectivities that are possible in domestic space. Number 1, the house with only a bed. Number 6, the house for 2 friendly roommates. Number 8, the house for 2 roommates divided by 2 corridors. Number 10, the house where 4 friendly people can live and work together. Number 16, the house for 4 pairs divided by 4 corridors. Number 22, the home office. Number 32, the house for 4 people that bathe apart but work together. Number 33, the house for people that work apart but bathe together. Number 39, the house where 2 people can live apart from the other 4. Number 45, the house without hierarchies. Number 47, the house for a person to sleep, bathe, cook, and play. Number 54, the house for 4 people who sleep alone but live together. Number 85, the house for 2 people that cook together. Number 107, the house that's 50% bedrooms. Number 109, the house for work and play. Number 113, the house for 3 people with 2 yards. Number 117, the house where people only order out. Number 131, the house for an average size household. Number 138, the house that's just a series of rooms.
So the project took the form of a public exhibition at the University of Michigan in 2018. The vitrines that were shown in the gallery space displayed the typological root of the home: the hallway, the enfilade, and the private room, making visible the deep structure of domestic space. By reducing the home to its barest spatial grammar, the catalog opens up the possibility of reprogramming.
So reclaiming the aura of the model showroom, the exhibition created a familiar atmosphere for consumption and display. Enticingly glossy, reflective, underlit, the vitrines deployed the tactics of commodity display to entice the viewer into alternative models of cohabitation.
This delirious backdrop of organizational charts, data sets, and planimetric combinations reproduced the pathologies of the suburban development. However, this time, the combinatorial possibilities of domestic space instead create a catalog that counters the norms and standards of the suburb that we recognize in our cities.
So laying claim to a territory through the deployment of domestic space isn't just about changing a single home, but it's also a particularly powerful methodology of colonization and control, especially in the suburban landscape. So instrumentalizing the home to remap a territory's physical resources, social forms, and legal formats, we were also curious about what were the urban possibilities of these new types. When they're deployed as a set, the municipal and civic protocols of a suburb perhaps shift and change the formats of ownership through new modes of commoning and cohabitation.
As expressed in Dan Graham's Homes for America project, the catalog's combinatorics of architectural style and model number leverages the iconography of the home to clad otherwise standard floor plans. Graham begins by listing the available styles and colors in a set of developer-tracked houses in Cape Coral, Florida. A, the sonata, B, the concerto, C, the overture, or D, the ballet, in a choice of colors such as white, stone gray, nickel, and seafoam green.
So Graham then systematically calculates all possible combinations of houses. Quote, a block of 8 houses utilizing 4 models and 4 colors might have 48 times 48 or 2,304 possible arrangements. The doggedness of his methodology, the exhaustion of his catalog, reconstructs the useless machine of development, heightening the contradictions and extremes of the suburban enclave. Yet, can we leverage this combinatorial game to transition to an alternative suburban landscape?
Playing this same game of kind of deadpan combinatorics to produce new suburban forms, the project deployed a simple random number generator to create a series of 10 by 10 matrices to lay out new neighborhoods, each with 100 homes.
So after procedurally placing each model home in its specified lot, the resulting layout created an unfamiliar landscape, one that resisted the homogeneity expected from these combinatorial games. So opposed to the logic of the cul-de-sac and ladder-based suburbia, the resulting fabric generated by these housing types created new confrontations, courtyards, commons, more obstructions, but also more routes and itineraries.
So this new catalog of homes includes the metrics of real estate values and development costs, dimensions, inventories, furnishing and fixtures, appliance redundancies, gross to net square footages, floor to area ratios, territorial extents and easement access, as well as access to municipal infrastructures. Like Arkazoom's No Stop City, these comparative inventories of appliances and fixtures reduce the home to a distribution of toilets, beds, and kitchens.
So the permutations constituted, we argue, a new catalog of domestic models. They were full of excesses, minimalisms, unusual layouts, programmatic configurations, and spatial redundancies. But what it did is, instead of reproducing very specific types of subjectivities, it instead leveraged the sort of the generic that's inherent in the domestic plan to create new forms of private and public life. These rearrangements of rooms produce unfamiliar housing types that question the often standardized kinship structures that are in the model home, creating new forms of use, ownership, and sharing.
So if the suburb can be seen as a kind of ubiquitous condition that we're all familiar with, this next project, called Houston Variations, reimagines a modest housing type in the very specific context of Houston, where we practice, experimenting with ways to transition from a kind of car-based urbanism into a new relationship between the city and its climate.
So while Houston is notorious for its sprawling highways and lack of zoning, distinctive spatial types have emerged in response to the city's regulatory environments. We'll be talking about these everyday buildings, such as the raised single-story office building, what we call the office mat type, and the low-rise drive-in courtyard apartment that produce very precise typological responses to Houston's underlying economic and climatic conditions. So this project asks, how does Houston offer a way to reframe typology not as a spatial form that's driven by the car, but actually as an open-ended process of social, technical, and environmental adaptations. So learning from the combinatorial series shown here of Loretta Vinciarelli's drawings, West Texas Types, the project asks if Houston, in East Texas, offers a way to reframe typology as an open-ended process of social of adaptation. So rather than producing a series of endless market-ready spatial products, can the inexhaustibility of type create a counter-project to the speculative city?
So for a little history, fueled by Houston's booming oil and petrochemical economy, the city underwent rapid development and suburbanization from the 1950s until the oil crash in the 1980s. The office mat type developed and evolved during this time to meet the growing demand for affordable office space outside of downtown, and dozens of examples were built in Houston, driven by the city's kind of speculative commercial real estate market. This type consists of a two-story column structure with an elevated single-story space. Some of the most notable examples are along the Richmond Avenue business corridor, designed by the Houston-based firm Neuhaus and Taylor from the developer client Gerald D. Hines in the early 1960s.
So the buildings were deeply influenced by Mises' 1958 Bacardi administrative building outside of Mexico City. It was built during the 50s and 60s. The office mats, deployed the sort of same abstractions of late modernist vocabulary and form, as well as the particular masking that Mises deployed. As one critic wrote, quote, "Any building that retains its clarity while standing over a herd of cars has achieved a great deal." So although the aesthetics flicker of these types flicker between the generic and these sort of monumental facades, the office mats and its organizational principles were driven by an intense attention to the economy of construction and the city's relationship to transportation. The tenants were typically small commercial companies, so costs had to be minimized and layouts made as efficient as possible. Parking and entrance lobbies were located below the buildings, as it was cheaper to park underneath the building than buy more land to accommodate car commuting suburban workers. When the lots were non-ideal sizes, they adjusted the envelopes by stepping them back from the edge of the property. And the cantilevered roofs and perimeter balconies, which we'll be showing here, were primarily used to reduce energy costs, making them rent competitive to meet the market's bottom line. So everything from their space planning to the construction methods was driven by this unforgiving economics of the serial reproduced speculative building.
So in the late 1960s, a kind of new housing type emerged that could be read as a variation of this office mat type, which you can see here.
Yeah.
Adapted into the kind of middle income multifamily housing. Reclad in wood siding, stucco, decorative stonework, or faux mansard roofs, the drive-in apartment retained the economic efficiency of the office mat's two-story scale with parking underneath. The primary transformation of the type was the addition of a central courtyard that functioned as the main circulation space of the building. From it, both ground floor and second floor units were accessed through open air balconies and stairs. The structural bay accommodated a row of parking spaces around the perimeter of the building beneath the second floor units. Despite the courtyard, access to light in the units was often limited to small openings on the exterior facade, and the apartments relied on air conditioning window units with virtually no access to cross ventilation, despite the kind of thinness of their perimeters.
And so although the low-rise courtyard apartment today remains one of the few places of affordable housing in our neighborhood for renters in the city today, these current permutations really reveal the exhaustion of the type with a complete lack of light, of air, and a kind of really sort of a small residential form. So as the mechanisms of speculative development in Houston are increasingly replacing these small-scale residential buildings that we show with luxury towers and townhouse developments, we're curious if there are alternative ways to increase density without displacing people to the periphery. And how can we use the typological impulse to imagine variations not as economic products, but instead as new forms of life? So this Project Houston Variations reimagines 20 new typological permutations for both the low-rise office mat and the drive-in courtyard, testing to what degree the constraints of the type allow a recalibration of the relationship between environmental enclosure and form.
So the complexity of the drive-in courtyard apartment offered kind of even more potential for variation. Rather than limiting the building to a single courtyard, the type's expansion into sort of multiple interconnected courtyards by shared balconies potentially offered new sequences and relationships between the units and the landscape. The expansion of the courtyard also yields more covered spaces that cannot be used for parking. By liberating the ground from the car, the type can operate as a kind of true courtyard with breezeways and covered passages that interconnect the collective spaces. This expansion also increases the density of the courtyards, maintaining unit sizes up to 1,200 square feet and include both efficiency suites and also larger 1 to 2 bedroom apartments. In this game of variations, the question remains, what is the farthest distance from the original that the type can kind of accommodate? Lose any one constraint in the type and its economic proposition is sort of lost.
So in addition to these variations, we also proposed a new climatic enclosure for these drive-in apartments. The ground floor retains a simple material palette of CMU shear walls, steel two-pillar columns, and spanning I-beams. And then within the courtyard, the typical open-air balcony has been reconceived as an oversized screen and porch. On the second floor facade, the envelope system of the drive-in has been adapted here to create a more open relationship with its exterior. The unit facades transform into an operable panel system that maximizes flexibility and access to light and air while using cheap and lightweight materials with simple aluminum frames, reducing cost and simplifying construction. And they slide on tracks embedded in the slab. So if the office mat and drive-in are responsive to the reciprocal relationship between property, the financial constraints of the market, and the role of the car, we argue that in this sort of transition of this typology, these types could also offer a counter project to the speculative development of the neoliberal city. And by adjusting the relationship between typological form, envelope, and relationship to the street, perhaps the pragmatism of the type could create an open air interior that addresses the climate needs while reducing energy costs.
So moving sort of from the space of the city into a landscape contained within a more ancient city. This next project, Palm House, examines the relationship between colonial extraction and greenhouse architecture, reclaiming this typology as kind of a life support system for both an ancient specimen as well as a future climate. So the project begins at the Orto Botanico in Italy, a garden founded by the University of Padua in 1545 for medicinal plant research. The garden takes the form of a circle divided into quadrants, each containing a carefully curated arrangement of botanical specimens. The herbs and plants in the garden, imported from all over the world, were used to train medical students to identify species for medicinal and therapeutic remedies. The specimens in the garden also served as the plant stock for the Venetian Republic's pharmaceutical trade. Because of the rarity and value of its specimens, the garden was fortified against theft with an imposing kind of circular stone wall that you can see around the perimeter.
So along this garden wall survives the oldest of the garden specimens, a 450-year-old Mediterranean palm, indigenous to Southern Europe with a variety of medicinal uses, shown here. The particular specimen became known more famously as Goethe's palm, serving as a critical subject for Goethe's theory on botanical morphology enumerated in a 1790 essay, The Metamorphosis of Plants. So super interesting is in this context, Goethe outlines a theory describing the relationship between a plant's environmental conditions and its patterns of growth, form, and development. So he argued that beyond the formal mechanisms of a Linnaean classification, that the plant's internal morphology was in constant tension with the plant's climatic conditions, from atmospheric compositions to soil nutrients to the availability of water.
So to protect this scientifically and culturally valuable specimen over the centuries, university gardeners constructed a series of temporary and permanent palm houses to both shelter and display the palm. Early etchings and drawings reveal elaborate structures that were built around the palm each winter and then removed in late spring.
The earliest photographic evidence of the palm house structure shown here was an ornate wooden glass shelter that was designed and built in the 1890s. It was later replaced by an operable concrete, steel, and glass greenhouse in the 30s after a cold wave almost killed the palm.
The current structure, which was renovated in 2007, transformed the Palm House into a high-tech enclosure featuring kind of radiant heating, as well as large panes of plate glass that open and close depending on temperature. Each stage of the Palm House architecture reveals the changing relationship between this living ecosystem and the technical, environmental, and material conditions required for its care.
So as illustrated in these historical examples, early greenhouses were often temporary structures, shown here, that were built to protect non-native species vulnerable to extremes in temperature and weather. However, shown here, in the 19th century, these seasonal shelters began to rapidly transform into new greenhouse typologies, emerging from the reciprocal development of building technologies such as iron, glass, and mechanized environmental systems. So as European colonial empires accumulated land, dispossessed people for the extraction of wealth and natural resources, they also built latrines to house the botanical spoils that were collected overseas. So long span iron structures could accommodate large tropical trees, and expansive glass envelopes maximized light. And then with the rise of hot water and steam heating, central mechanical plants could simulate a constantly warm and humid tropical climate year-round, despite the cold weather and climates of Northern Europe. So examples like the Palm House and Kew Gardens were really functioned as these public vivariums that exhibited the living products of colonial power.
Today, contemporary greenhouse landscapes take the form of kind of immense distribution centers of living material. As demand for horticultural products grows, a logistical landscape of industrial greenhouses like these have emerged, further mobilizing the extensive infrastructures of land, technology, and capital. For instance, agricultural and horticultural industries in the Westland region of the Netherlands have created a vast system of greenhouse interiors amounting to almost 40 square miles. This current generation of greenhouses utilizes drones, sensors, hydroponic systems, and other technologies to optimize their interior climate. Pink grow lights produce a perpetual state of photosynthesis, creating hectares of eerily illuminated interior ecosystems.
So both these historical palm houses that we were looking at, as well as the contemporary plant distribution centers, prompt us to ask, how can the architectural systems of the greenhouse reimagine the traditional role of nature as an object of both consumption and contemplation? And can we instead make visible the infrastructures of care, energy, and exchange that are actually required for the growth of each specimen? So continuing the 4 centuries of care and preservation that began in 1585 with the planting of Goethes palm, and taking cues from contemporary greenhouse technologies, our proposal Palm House imagined 3 future prototypes to house this specimen.
So Palm House number 1 is a circular structure that suspends a series of kind of fabric ducts that surround the palm and are connected to an air and vapor compressor controlled by an air schedule. It expels kind of precise atmospheric clouds and compositions, which envelop the palm when external conditions stray from the ideal. Calibrating the palm's immediate atmosphere to counter these kind of dangerous particulate clouds, molecular swarms, and synthetic ozones, care workers can curate a more chemically compatible environment for the specimen. The structure breathes, inhaling, inflating, exhaling, and sighing, becoming an extension of the plant's living and sensing ecology.
So Palm House number 2 responds to the increasing concentration of environmental pollutants that are increasingly overwhelming the plant's natural osmotic defense systems. So composed of an infrastructure of filter panels, the wall assemblies can open and close with a motorized gear system, limiting the infiltration of or increasing the ventilation of airborne particulates. So workers maintain and operate the shingled and breathable envelope, carefully monitoring atmospheric dust and particulates and replacing spent filter units in the structure to assist, and even opening up the facade to assist with pollination.
And the third Palm House allows for these same technicians to calibrate its balance of heat and light, protecting it from extreme temperatures and radiation conditions as the climate continues to shift. The structure is designed as an open-air armature that uses solar curtains to regulate its exposure to light. A secondary structure of movable wall modules installed with grow lights and heat lamps can be repositioned to provide the palm with extra heat and light as needed. So by calibrating these conditions, workers can adjust and design the spectral output for the palm, protecting the plant from extreme temperature fluctuations while also presenting these kind of harmful conditions from affecting it.
So the Palm House project took on the form of an exhibition at the Citigroup Gallery in New York. So we filled the low linear space with 3 light boxes that suspended the images of each of the palm houses for visitors to view. From the street, a passerby could glimpse the glowing images, almost like a greenhouse itself, hovering in the center of the space. Upon entry, the small scale of the room created this confrontation and kind of glowing ambience between the viewer and the images.
And the saturated presence of the images worked in contrast to another kind of array of technical images and supporting evidence lining the wall. The 50 tablets contained orthographic, axonometric, and detailed drawings that described the assemblies of each of the palm houses, but also they had material inventories, timesheets, specifications, and methods of care that went into both the production of the design itself, but also the construction of the exhibition and the care of the plant itself.
So the idea was that the representation of these techniques of production were just as critical to the project's research agenda. So alongside the drawings displayed in the exhibition were also texts that documented the role of the palm's caretakers, including how often workers clean and prune the leaves, their watering schedules, and when to add nutrients and chemicals to the soil. We also included email dialogues discussing the histories of the palm houses and the maintenance protocols of the palms with the head librarians, curators, and gardeners of the Ordo Botanica, represented alongside the technical drawings of the wall.
We also included a kind of material acknowledgement, which described the origins, mining and refining locations, trade legislation, and regional environmental impact of the materials used in the construction of the project. So this include kind of documents which examined the supply chain of materials used in greenhouses like glass and acrylic, and aluminum extrusions, following their trail from extraction to production to distribution. Kind of learning from Jane Hutton, who writes in Reciprocal Landscapes that these textures, smells, structures of particular materials give people kind of tactile and intimate contact with fragments of distant landscapes, their myriad social and ecological relationships. Through this lens, the architecture of the project engages more intimately and deeply, not just with the land and its specimens, but also kind of sensuous qualities of its environmental and technical systems.
So thinking with and against the kind of technical optimization that often is associated with the greenhouse and horticultural production, what we're interested in is how to redeploy the greenhouse as less of as a site of extraction and production, but more as a critical life support system for these precarious organisms, creating an idea or a relationship with ecology that goes beyond extinction. So Palm House reimagines the historic preservation of a plant or questions what preservation in ecological sense is, not by recreating a past climate, but instead through demonstrating the idea of life support itself and how it relates to the palm survival. So fundamentally, the project asks, in the face of extinction, what are the costs, means, and methods of perpetual care?
So translating these machines of environmental control, kind of from the garden and these more extreme environments of control that we just talked about to the domestic interior, Hotwall is a one-to-one prototype that examines the trends of cultivating tropical plants in our domestic interiors and unpacks the relationship to global systems of extraction and exchange of those horticultural products. So as we described in the Palm House project, alongside the development of the Longspan greenhouse, emerging environmental technologies also transformed the domestic interior. Bay windows, sun porches, and hothouses brought sunlight into domestic space, enabling indoor cultivation of tropical plants. Heating and plumbing allowed homeowners to produce these kind of artificial climates, simulating the heat and humidity of tropical colonies. These houseplants were also marketed for their health and sanitation benefits. They could purify polluted urban air, aid respiration, and increase humidity in furnace-heated rooms. Quickly, the tropical aesthetic became a pervasive fixture of the domestic interior. Orchid manias and fern fevers reflected an insatiable desire to produce a kind of fragrant, sensual, and vital atmosphere through the profusion of tropical houseplants. Figuring prominently in these interiors is a specimen of particular interest to us, another palm, as it happens, called the Ravenea rivularis, or the Majesty palm. We like palms, as you can tell.
The Majesty palm is a species of tree native to Madagascar, growing in shallow standing water on forested riverbanks. Today, while millions of species circulate abundantly and affordably all around the world, just $19 at your local Home Depot, Only 900 specimens survive in the wild, threatened by deforestation, pollution, and forest fires. Further contributing to the species' decline is its global popularity as a houseplant, driving unsustainably high levels of seed harvesting that prevent the palm from maintaining a robust wild population. So although it can grow to a height of 100 feet in the wild, shown here on the left, since its domestication in the 1980s, it commonly takes the form of a modest potted plant. So due to inadequate soil conditions, as well as the difficulty of maintaining the bright, warm, and humid atmosphere of the plants that the plant requires, these Ravenea houseplants grow to only a fraction of their size and often fail to survive for more than a year.
So these houseplants are marketed kind of not only for their exotic imagery, but also for their presumed health and productivity benefits, repeating the trends of the Victorian era. Countless lifestyle magazines and scientific studies tout the psychological, emotional, and physical advantages of indoor plant life. They reduce stress, improve indoor air quality, increase work-life efficiency. This staging of the interior has been further streamlined through subscription plant services and creating kind of must-have markets for home offices and office interiors alike.
So as you can tell, this project really took it was research we did during COVID, and so we became kind of obsessed with this, how we were in many ways reproducing these sort of Victorian manias. And so during COVID, people were kind of confined to their homes. Viral worlds of botanical care began to emerge that also produced these sort of amazing solidarity networks of amateur horticulturalists. From overwatering to oversharing, entire networks of YouTube, DIY videos, and care manuals for domestic flora emerged as content producers imaged and distributed the techniques and results of domestic cultivation. So in the wild spaces of TikTok worlding, hashtag plant life threads discuss how to create interior ecosystems, pollinate plants, propagate cuttings, and make music for your flora. However, it's important to know that these Monstera manias and ficus fevers also reflected this new Victorian madness for an inexhaustible supply of trendy tropicals. And it was this kind of emerging global market that had this very significant cost, social, labor, and ecological cost on the workers that care for these plants.
So to begin the project, we kind of started by creating a portrait of this common domestic companion. As a geopolitical collage, the portrait tracks the specimen's patterns of territorial migration, distribution, and consumption. The image seeks to put a wrinkle in the traditional representations of power, such as the portrait of a sovereign, and capital. The strewn about digital artifacts and documents reveal the invisible structures of treaties, protocols, and paperwork that undergird these territories, keeping the flow of capital smooth, visible, and seamless. As a representational type, the portrait recenters this non-human subject, making visible the ecological narratives and colonial contexts of this species as well, tracing its journey from Madagascar to Home Depot to our homes.
So taking in these ecological narratives, hothouse technologies, and trending desires, our proposal, Hot Wall, imagined a household appliance for the cultivation of interior plant life and as well as environmental awareness. So composed of a lightweight aluminum frame and equipped with red-blue spectrum grow lights, the Hot Wall prototypes aids the abundant growth of leafy foliage, artificially recreating the spectral conditions of a plant's indigenous habitat, with the goal of increasing the plant's life and longevity and health. So what resulted in this project was a domestic object that juxtaposed its biotechnical systems with the norms of domestic comfort, and really kind of the idea was to create a counter to the minimal tropical hipster chic imaginary that we have been so inundated with.
The project also examined how our recent domestic confinement has redefined not just social life, but has extended the regimes of care to produce new bonds between humans and non-humans, enhancing what Donna Haraway describes as the disturbingly and pleasurably tight coupling of organic and technical systems. So the overly large, kind of awkwardly mobile and weirdly ambient object renders visible these forms of kinship, or we hope. The cart's capacity for constant repositioning dislodges the familiar arrangements and habits of private life, opening up new structures, we think, for cohabitation and cultivation.
So in the project, staged in this domestic interior, the glowing lights produce this kind of ambient, but also agonistic form of coexistence. Bathed in the artificial pink wash of the grow lights, It created a place of comfort for the plant, but often discomfort for the human cohabitants. Also part of the hot wall was an aluminum shelf that supported the heavy weight of the plants, as well as the evidence of the sort of dirty work of cultivation, earthy piles, stray leaf clippings, misting bottles, and soiled gloves. And the idea was that the machines would kind of really make legible the forms of stewardship that occurred between plant companion species and their human caretakers, and kind of using that to reimagine what domestic comfort could be. So the pink glow of the red-blue spectrum lights produce a tableau in which the plants, their habitats, and their ecologies were not these sort of sterile backdrops, but instead living, transpiring, and confrontational entities.
So part of our ambition was to kind of disturb the familiar spaces of our well-kept kind of domestic spheres. The palm sort of revels in its harsh pink glow and creates a kind of unfamiliar and disorienting atmosphere. The walls become pink, the whites in the room become green, and the greens transform into a dull and ruddy crimson. So transplanting the technological apparatus of the greenhouse again into the home, this project, I think, makes a claim for how we might reformat, or at least think about reformatting our interior worlds, even if it's a kind of confrontational way of adjusting to our climatic conditions.
So from the garden to the home and now out into the forest. So this final project that we're going to share today, Field Station, is an architectural experiment that explores the spatial practices of environmental sensing, climate action, and forest care. So due to the incredibly complex relationship between timber extraction, resource extraction, and property, forest practices have evolved over the centuries into a very intricate set of social, financial, and ecological structures. So from the Charter of the Forest shown here, 1217, that granted commoners access to the forest and its products in England, to on the right, contemporary activist movements such as Ende Gelände, which continues to occupy the Hambach Forest in Germany, protecting it from mining. The forest persists as a revolutionary site of environmental care. It's through this lens that we think that the forest offers a crucial space in which to reimagine the kind of instruments of ecological sovereignty in a more than human world.
Allies of the forest are increasingly harnessing digital tools, softwares, and sensors to manage landscapes and react in real time to destructive extraction, illegal logging, land treaty violations, and pollution. In the ongoing struggle, for example, against Chevron Texaco's pollution of the Ecuadorian Amazon, prosecutors continuously gather environmental data as proof of the ecological catastrophe, converting the forest into a juridical court and vast technical laboratory. According to artist Ursula Byman and architect Paulo Tavares, according to them. So as another example, DIY sensor networks and data sharing platforms can empower citizen scientists in initiatives that foreground climate education and action. Jennifer Gabrus's ongoing Smart Forests project deploys sensors in experimental forests to demystify these technologies for an expanded public. It is these forms of ecological stewardship that the Field Station, an architecture of environmental sensing, experimentation, and observation, offers a more participatory set of tools for forest defenders today. So, but any discussion of the Field Station, I think before we move on to our project, it has to first begin by acknowledging that many scientific outposts, weather stations, and military research sites emerged from imperial and settler colonial infrastructures. These stations served many economic and political agendas, from the acquisition of local ecological knowledge for the development of agriculture and the identification of natural resources, to the establishment of territorial power through data gathering missions and mapping projects. So for example, historian Megan Brady describes how the United States used the Tropical Field Station as an extension of its imperial power after the Spanish-American War in 1898. So after acquiring Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines and Guam as colonies, the U.S. embarked on a network, or established a network of field stations staffed by American scientists and researchers. And as the U.S. gained political power in the Caribbean, these sites, such as Barrow, Colorado Island, which became the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and Harvard Botanic Station for research, also the Atkins Institution, in Cuba, became important spaces of ecological fieldwork for U.S. scientists. So while field stations are entangled within these colonial histories, the research conducted at these sites forms a critical knowledge base for understanding the local environmental effects of climate change. Often field stations bear witness to the ongoing environmental traumas caused by the same processes of colonial research, extraction, and agriculture that led to their establishment. Today, field stations can serve as a critical infrastructure for environmental research, education, conservation, and creating sites of meaningful collaboration between between researchers and broader publics. For example, pictured here, the Indigenous Guardians Initiative, launched in 2017 by the Canadian government, provides grant funding to support Indigenous-led groups to coordinate field station research, educational programs, and further integrate traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, in scientific and environmental management projects. One such group is the Scotty Creek Research Station, pictured here, which became the first Indigenous-led research station in Canada, which was in 2022, last year. The initiative helps fund conservation of millions of acres of land and ocean, supporting partnerships between scientists and Indigenous groups to monitor and study the impacts of climate change on the region.
So yet, despite its contribution to research and education, the field station today is actually an increasingly precarious institution due to unreliable funding sources, difficulties in securing land due to development and habitat loss, and as well as partisan environmental policies that are threatening scientific research. As E.O. Wilson, the scientist, notes, Earth's populations place pressures on field stations and create a sense of urgency in field station activities. Quote, field stations monitor and report on ecological matters such as the effects of climate change and are sometimes in the midst of the resulting chaos. Yet only by gathering these site-specific data sets through experiments and multi-generational sensing projects can we really actually start to understand the long-term as well as short-term ecological damage of climate change. So in these parallel projects of decolonization and environmental care, we are curious how the field station and its associated practices of observation, restoration, as well as community land stewardship could offer new spaces for climate action.
So the field station proposed a prototype, an architectural prototype that explores these spatial practices of climate action as well as forest care. The project is a public art piece currently at the Sam Fox School of Design at Washington University in St. Louis. Consists of 6 panels mounted in kind of aluminum truss structures, representing a field station and the possible forms of life that unfold within. As a hypothesis, the project asks, how can practices of environmental sensing be reoriented away from extraction towards a more convivial, reciprocal relationship to the land?
So although the art piece is located in St. Louis, the actual site of our research and ongoing collaborations with local scientists is in the Sam Houston National Forest, about 50 miles northwest of Houston. So before colonization by Spanish, French, and Anglo settlers, people have occupied the land for over 12,000 years, including the Acoquisa tribes of the San Jacinto and Trinity Rivers Basin. Today, the forests are overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the National Forest Service. The terrain's a rich assemblage of ecologies that make up the East Texas piney woods regions, including stands of loblolly pine shown here, bottomland hardwoods, deciduous forested wetlands, river swamps, and coastal prairies.
And beneath the surface of the forest are outcrops of uranium-bearing strata, Eocene and Paleocene oil and gas fields, and quartz-rich industrial sands. These ecologies and geologies are governed by the 1960 Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, which ensures the balance of management of all forest resources, including recreation, wildlife, watersheds, timber, and minerals. So while the forest appears, when you're there, as ostensibly wild, the land is in fact a highly managed territory, a patchwork of private property and public lands, hosting everything from camping and farming, mining, oil drilling, and timber harvesting.
So located in the National Forest on the site of a former WPA fish hatchery is the Sam Houston State University Center for Biological Field Studies, which supports ecological research, restoration, and education. The field station is an aggregation of industrial sheds, stick frame structures, test landscapes, teaching laboratories, and outdoor experiments. So the former fish hatchery shown here in this aerial view, its ponds and canals host a diverse and evolving ecosystem that are constantly being maintained, including restored prairies and canebrakes, as well as marshlands and loblolly forests. According to the biologist and station manager, Alan Bybeth, the ongoing mandate of the CBFS is to ensure the biodiversity and abundance of the forest ecosystems. So making this process difficult is the institution's shoestring budget, as well as ongoing deed and property disputes with nearby oil speculators.
So we're kind of using this, the CBFS, the Center for Biological Field Studies, as a model. The project imagines how architecture could engage with these lively practices of environmental sensing and climate action in disturbed landscapes of the Anthropocene. As Anna Singh writes, to describe a patchy Anthropocene that is politically made, ecologically remade, uncannily unreal, we need both observations and thought experiments. This uncanny hybridity of politics and ecology, of colonial ghosts and neo-colonial presence, of natural worlds and industrial systems opens up a space in which new practices of environmental care can unfold, frictionful. Within this context, we ask, what would a future landscape of citizen science, field stations, activist climate camps, and autonomous woodlands look like?
So the field station can serve, beyond research, as an operational base for scientists performing fieldwork, as well as provide ground support for agitation against federal concessions for oil and minerals. Equipped with air, water, and soil sensors, field stations can also measure ecological disturbance and pollutant emissions, monitor habitat distress. Solar panel arrays provide an energy source for recharging stations, and remote Wi-Fi transmitters provide power and satellite connections for both experiments and protests. Water catchment and filtration creates a freely available water supply, and lockers provide secure and dry storage for everything from laptops to fresh changes of clothes.
Somewhere between kind of a tent and a building, the field station contains many tools and trajectories. It's full of research documents, a map of a mine to be blockaded, laundry hung to dry, a discussion circle, a seedling experiment, and a hovering drone. Serving as a low-tech laboratory and mobile classroom, the field station can adapt to a wide variety of environmental conditions, offering a space for on-the-fly data gathering, sensor troubleshooting, experimentation, pedagogy.
So the project deploys low-tech building systems that require minimum site prep, are easy to assemble, can be adapted to multiple terrains, and have a low environmental impact. The envelope is composed of operable mesh panels and adjustable roof pieces, and the structural columns offer mounting locations for equipment, and running underneath the floor, cable trays that coordinate to wire conduits for easy power access. Impermanent, hackable, and buildable for the scientist or layperson alike, the field station prototype we argue is an architecture that could simplify the construction, operation, and also eventual dismantling of the structure.
So within this, the images that we produced are sleeping bags, storage lockers, the remnants of forgotten meals, troves of dog-eared field guides, rocks bristling with sensors, cases for delicate instruments, sensor tripods, circuit boards, all suggesting forms of life, of studying, of monitoring, and troubleshooting that can occur here. Immersed in this lush understory of kind of ferns and fungi, these tableaus imagine joyous new protocols for stewardship and care within the Sam Houston National Forest, in a landscape that is both an ecosystem and a living laboratory.
So we were interested in how architecture could function as an open system that could be manipulated, expanded, and collapsed using simple tools and without expertise. And the tectonics of the project were also reflected in the exhibition structure. So we've been really interested in the work of philosopher Ivan Illich, who writes about these sort of convivial tools, which are not complex or mystifying technologies, but instead enable, quote, the autonomous and creative intercourse amongst people and with their environment. So drawing inspiration from the improvised tectonics of straps, flaps, and scaffolding that are common to sensor infrastructures and often found in field stations, the project's low-tech construction and DIY aesthetics seek to democratize the tools of observation. The idea is that it was an open-ended architecture, which is just as critical for practices of sensing as well as for ground-up eco-political power, allowing people to react real time to habitat disturbance and also mobilizing agendas of long-term environmental conservation.
So alongside this installation that we did in St. Louis, we also gathered a kind of trove of documents, maps, and information from our research into a field guide together for the forest. Representing the Sam Houston National Forest required a kind of non-linear assemblage, an open document that reflected the contested and contingent practices that define the territory, imagining the field station's possible interfaces within these kind of competing interests.
And so and the idea was to give this guide to the students in WashU, so that like it wasn't this non-site that happened somewhere in Houston, but it was an idea of kind of embedding this environmental condition into the space of architectural pedagogy. So it showed from archaeological digs and preserves to test landscapes and extraction sites. We're just interested in how the forest offered a model of kind of earthy or patchy terrain. And the idea was that the field guide avoided the sort of simplifications or reductions that we often see when thinking about a landscape or thinking about architecture's relationship to it. The idea was that it put forward this very sort of messy relationship between embodied research, climate action, and a landscape. And through that, the field guide as well as the field station was a sort of a suggestion about how architecture could participate or kind of reimagine the environmental encounter and reposition architecture within this sort of practice of reciprocity, abundance, and care in the landscape. Yeah.
That's all we got.
Thank you.
Thanks. Little while. Good.
I'm just gonna pull up a chair.
Okay.
I'll ask like one or two and then So thank you, first of all, for sharing your work. It's such a pleasure and a delight. I mean, everything is so beautifully represented and beautifully drawn that it's, to begin with, a pleasure to just look at it. And then there's just such an intelligence behind all of it. So just to start with that, I wanted to maybe start with a common theme that I saw and just to maybe ask you about that. It seems like you have a strong interest in architecture as an open system, and that carries through all of the projects, right? From the model house to the field station. And so, for me, that's a really interesting way of also thinking about type, because sometimes our attitude towards type has this kind of reduced architecture to like the work of containing specific types of program and specific ways of life. And so I think your project in the model house project, I think really gets at a critique of that and really saying that actually we can think typologically without necessarily doing the work of constantly like bounding very specific relationships and kind of crystallizing them. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of this kind of resistance to type as a container. But I wanted to ask you specifically with that project, what is your attitude towards the room? Because the unit is the room, and the room is always the same size. And so I just was curious how you were thinking about the room itself. Is there a difference when you think about the room as the building block of a kind of it is like a social system, socio-spatial system, right? Where the room itself, is that a way of also having tactics against commodification, because you don't never commodify a room on its own, right? You commodify the house and the parcel, right? And that's the kind of spatial commodity. So yeah, I don't know, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, because in the Model Homes project in particular, the room, and actually I think in all of them, the room is not this kind of a shape with a bed in it or a kitchen in it, right? The room is more a kind of an incredibly generic kind of moment or pause in a larger series of spaces. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're really interested in thinking of, like in the same way we were thinking about typology, not driven through program, but typology driven through a kind of a deeper structure that produces form by organizing a relationship between an exterior and interior, or between a kind of a sequence of spaces. And so I think there was something, the idea in the Model Homes project is the room was not maybe specific to its function, right? The bathrooms were ridiculously oversized, and the living rooms were too small. It was thinking about it almost through the same logics of looking at it more almost like an org chart, right? Where it just, all it did was serve to connect other rooms and produce through its series a type of form. And so I think that when you look at the developer catalog, you see the master bedroom or the bathroom suite and the kind of all the problematics that are so tied into that nomenclature and the kind of very precise ways, the shapes that kind of produce those logics and those kind of hierarchies. And so the idea was that to kind of make it as almost generic, as absurdly generic as possible, all of a sudden could no longer place a hierarchy or a sort of subjectivity onto the room. And so it became liberated from a type of life, I guess.
I mean, the other thing that we considered and talked about a lot in that in identifying roomness as a condition was that the economics of construction, housing, and the home doesn't allow for spaces that are really multi-use in general, other than, I guess, the suburban garage. So it has to act as kind of this Trojan horse where like each room had a designation, but it was also rendered sort of generic so that each one was just this diagrammatic container.
Right.
Yet, yes, we're not talking specifically about where the kind of core sits to, between the kitchen and the bath or something like that. So its ubiquity of sameness allows for the possibility, I think, of multiple use within it, but also without having to actually say this room is empty. Right. So I think that was kind of
and that's like part of the open-ended system, I guess.
Yeah.
And part of it's subversion or subversiveness.
Right.
I think that's really great. And I was particularly interested in the result when you see it all multiplying and you see it looks so even as the rooms are familiar, and when you're creating those configurations, it doesn't seem like it's really defamiliarizing the domestic that much. And then when you see it then aggregating and creating this landscape, it's like neither a dense landscape, it's not a suburban landscape, it's like this kind of totally other. And so I think that's really great. But I wonder, maybe this is also a segue into my second question, which is about your attitude towards discomfort. Because in some way the bedrooms being so small is pretty uncomfortable. And then that's something that I was thinking about also with the Palm House in terms of your, you're kind of embracing that the magenta light is not necessarily amenable to humans, but it is for the plant. And so you're looking at that friction. And so, of course, you're trying to, avoid the fetishizing of the plant itself. But my question for you is there a danger of fetishizing instead mechanical, right? And I think that you're clear in many instances that you're not doing a conventional techno-optimism, and I think that is clear. And you are interested in highlighting the technical in order to talk about how we steward life, and so that's clear. But I still think that I wanted to unpack that a little bit in a sense, because there were certain moments where these magentas, so estranging, and like it's uncomfortable even just to look at it as an image. Like you can already imagine that being in that room would be super uncomfortable. So can you talk a little bit about does that attitude towards discomfort have to do with a resistance to fetishizing the mechanical or the technical, which is something that you're walking on that line, right? So I'm curious how you're thinking about that.
I mean, I think that we end up always, once we start researching where material comes from, how plants are cared for in industrial systems, we end up in a space that feels already uncomfortable, invariably. And so I think that always gets sort of re-embedded. But the discomfort that we always, at least with hot wall and kind of idea of the comfort of another specimen, like of the palm in the garden being almost frozen to death, and then they construct these architectures to protect it and keep it because of this history. That discomfort, I think, especially through these kind of architectural tectonic systems, is a kind of a pedagogical tool always at the end of the day, right? It's something that it's an estranging effect, right? It's something that when you're in that room with that element that transmits the amount of solar gain that a palm in Madagascar might presumably desire, say that, it's just not a space where it makes you realize how distant it is from its space of origin, right? So even that simple move we still think is fundamentally quite interesting.
Yeah, and also maybe to address the techno-positive or elephant in the room, but I think that we definitely are extremely interested, not just in technical systems, but like kind of making sure that they are legible in an architecture, because I think so many of the conventions of architecture, what they do is they hide and mystify the kind of the vast resources of capital, of technology, of land, of labor, of materials and resources that are mobilized to produce architecture, right? Mm-hmm. And so our work is, because it's usually in an exhibition space or it's speculative, we're interested in its pedagogical kind of power. And so we're really interested in making sure that nothing is maybe hidden in the projects, but that the technologies, the tools, even the techniques of abstraction that we use are kind of put out there as part of the kind of the politics of the project. So I think that we are definitely interested in kind of laying bare those mechanisms, and especially for the greenhouse project, which is really about these kind of incredibly intense mechanized envelopes that, they are mundane and ubiquitous in the kind of greenhouse landscape. They produce and kind of enable the kind of vast global exportation of food, but it's something that is kind of completely alien to the way that we consume food every day, right? And so we were super interested in kind of bringing that to the foreground and creating an architecture of that legibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we are looking at specifically the more technical greenhouses,
Yeah.
right, that are in the Netherlands, as opposed to the kind of sea of plastic in the south of Spain. That's a much more kind of plastic and
almost a handmade
structure, handmade, that has much more horrifying labor conditions associated with it, and also the kind of impact on the environment is very different in that space. So we do tend towards that kind of mechanization because it's touted as the solution to a future global food crisis, where those greenhouses are being exported to landscapes here, right? Like, so,
Right.
And that's the kind of product, the spatial product becomes that greenhouse.
Right. I think we should maybe open to the audience. I'm sure that hands just going straight up.
Hi, thank you very much. First question I have is I don't understand why, Daniel, you don't live in Houston.
Pardon?
New York joke.
I get it.
Zing.
I should have known that. Okay. Yeah, I do not live. We live near him. Yeah, at one point.
Your central direction seems to be Western and culture. Did a lot of research. I'm wondering whether you did any research into people like Edward T. Hall, The Hidden Dimension, Buckminster Fuller, and things like that, because I'm a graduate of City College in 1960. And one of the main books that I was introduced to, in fact, my whole design perspective, was Edward T. Hall's books, The Hidden Dimension and Silent Language. And his description of the cultural perception differences between a Japanese home and a Western American home was so revealing in terms of how we are so ingrained in our cultural, I also was impressed by the use of the word stewardship when our whole society is based on a misinterpretation of that divinity of dominion, the difference between dominion and stewardship. So in a truly stewardship society, you would never take a palm outside and bring it into an environment. That's not good stewardship. So there's always that kind of, I'm doing this, why should I be doing this? So the first thing is, are you familiar with Edward T. Hall's philosophy? And I would be surprised if all this research you never heard of Edward T. Hall.
I mean, yes, we've read, a while ago, it's not maybe one of our references that we use now, the whole in the work of Buckminster Fuller, and I think it's really interesting in kind of laying the groundwork of the kind of the idea of our environments are not a homogeneous kind of global condition, but have very kind of precise specificities, climates, differences, and that kind of those differences can really animate architecture. And I know, so I think that it's like kind of an incredibly important kind of set of voices. But I think one of the things that we're interested in doing, and you pointed out exactly right, we are interested in examining and questioning largely the kind of institutions of Western architecture. because those in many ways have become, as the kind of scions of capital, like those have become a kind of some of the most powerful and violent kind of forces that are not just territorializing the planet, but are also kind of, as Elisa has written about very extensively, that are kind of their process of colonizing the world have completely kind of ravaged our climate and our environment, right? And so we're very interested in looking at the suburb, the model home, the greenhouse, the field station. These are projects that have their origins in the kind of the Western canon and the Western sort of institution of power. And so I think it's important for us to address them and question them and unpack them and find ways to kind of to reclaim them as architectures that aren't violent, or that could have maybe less extractive, less violent futures. And so I think you're exactly right. We are interested in that is sort of the dominant critique of the work, right? Like those are the institutions that we're interested in questioning.
At the same time, there were many examples of other cultures adapting to their environment.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
The igloo, the tent, and they successfully for centuries have adapted and survived. And we seem to want to go in and say, you're wrong, you're right.
Yeah, we're also not interested in being arbiters of good and bad stewardship, right? Like that to me is a very complicated set of parameters that is different based on location and minutia of environmental conditions in a region and of culture. But I do think that what your articulation of kind of the problematics of us looking at that palm, for example, that's brought from Madagascar, but the point of looking at that is to kind of unpack the ubiquity and the sort of normalcy of that condition that is usually not, people don't think twice when you pay $10 for this thing at IKEA or at Home Depot. So all of a sudden we said, how did this get here? Because we don't know where it came from. Oh, it came from this farm in Florida. After it was imported from Madagascar, it went on a truck. It was, had life support systems in the truck from Florida to Michigan or whatever. And so all of a sudden, all of those extensive support systems that are kind of standing in for a stewardship that is, so it becomes a very problematic position about stewardship. So that's what we want to unpack, I guess.
Well, and another thing just to add to that really struck me with the Palm House project is that I did have a moment where I thought, there is this kind of why are we trying to keep the planet alive in this way? But there was then something that you said about climate change, with the unpredictability of climate means that we are going to have to find different ways of keeping things alive, because the climate will not be able to sustain life in the same way anymore. And so I think that walking that line too, in terms of what does it mean to sustain life right now, has changed, right? It's not just about the ability to sort of create a proper symbiosis with an ecosystem, because the ecosystems themselves are going to be undergoing such change that part of the introduction of mechanization might be where the mechanical becomes less violent, or a mitigation for the violence that's been acted upon the ecosystem. Anyway, there are more questions. Peggy, go ahead.
I'm wondering whether you have ever felt the limitation or frustration of working axonometric.
Ooh.
That's a really good question. Maybe what we're often confronted with is the limitation of working in perspective, which offers such a kind of privileged and singular point of view that it privileges the kind of the human perspective. And so we work in axonometric as more of a kind of a machine vision, right? It's in many, obviously it's an impossible kind of fictionalized account, but it's a way of looking in a type of sort of looking, it allows you to look at kind of for this instance, in this image, it allows you to kind of look at an architecture or in a landscape at this sort of simultaneously from a point of view that is not possible purely from a human body, right? And so I think that that's one of the reasons that we work with axonometric. It allows you to kind of unpack these machines. It helps you sort of redeploy them. Maybe you have a better answer.
I'm not going to be happy with this answer, but I think we always go through the alternatives, right? We start with thinking about completely different vantage points that we're interested in, and often I think that because we're working in a digital medium, the axonometric feels more kind of true to its medium instead of a replication of a 35mm camera through perspectival, work in Rhino or whatever tool or platform that we're using. So I think that, if we weren't rendering, which is really we're image processing through these specific tools, we would be using maybe other vantage points. But in this case, it feels more part of that medium in and of itself.
Yes, it's so object-oriented. And
Yeah.
it seems to me that one of the things that you're talking about is something that's a much more complicated relationship between environment
Yes.
and object. And so that would be something I would do. But I also, another way to think about it, which is maybe you've answered, that if we're going from a non-human centric, not archaeologically packaged way, that it it objectifies in a way that I think we architects understand and love. I have to say gorgeous. But I wonder whether at a certain point that's going to, you're just going to be, I'm going to say smarter than that, or
Yeah.
I shouldn't say,
No.
that you'll recognize that there's something else that it captures.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's also, I completely agree with everything you're saying.
Completely.
And I think what the substitution that we do is, or that we're interested in, is that it is, this is wrong, but we see it as a kind of an easy image to read for,
Right.
at least for architects, for this audience, right? And so what we substitute for that is the kind of proliferation of indicators of how a thing is used, right? So we
Right.
really, the intent and focus is not on the kind of object of the building necessarily, in this case, maybe more so than others, but it is the kind of the detritus, the stuff that represents the moments of occupation or existence. So that, I think, is how we try to absolve ourselves of that the problem, which maybe we don't succeed in. But it's a good question.
Yeah.
And in the future, no.
And it's something that we're always testing and experimenting with.
MC was next.
Hi. So I grew up in Houston, and I had a farm that was in Cold Spring, Texas, which is right on the edge of this forest. And I remember walking around the forest, San Houston Forest Park. It's a hunting ground. Pretty sure.
All sorts of stuff.
Yeah. And I guess I'm interested because part of hunting is scouting out these areas, and trying to find the best site for putting your shed to observe, essentially. And I feel like you guys are also kind of doing a similar thing, which I think is really interesting. So I wonder about the aesthetic choices of this, which kind of goes back to what Elise was saying earlier. Because I guess I imagine most Texans coming upon this would be kind of shocked. So I'm just thinking, if you're covered in camouflage and I don't know, put an American flag on it, it would be pretty discreet.
Terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned camouflaging earlier, so I guess I just wondered if you could talk about that, and also kind of the preservation of maybe fauna as well as flora, animals, if you guys are also interested in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an amazing kind of comment and reflection, because it was one of the things that we really, at the very beginning of the project, we really tested what the aesthetics were. Sure, if you camouflaged it, it'd become this sort of invisible observer, right? But at the same time, we're kind of really wanted to separate the project from types of surveillance that are so often associated with these types of domination over an environment. And so we were interested in making it a highly legible, different, an architecture that did not belong, as a way to definitely estrange it from some of those aesthetic tendencies. And so, but I think, I mean, that's definitely one of the kind of the projects is really making it a thing, maybe that isn't from there, but it's something that kind of produces a difference and isn't this sort of hidden surveillance apparatus in the landscape.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. The reality on the ground in Texas especially is one that is probably much more in line with what you're talking about than
In some places, yeah.
than other places. But I think that the danger in any kind of occupation of a landscape like that with we're trying to kind of do I guess, a counterblind in that way, right? The point is at least how do you use some of these tools and technologies? Like it is very common to see a drone flying over these forests because that's how contemporary foresters are surveying the status and growth of the trees that are about ready to be harvested, right? So there's already a surveillance apparatus that's there that's already kind of doing that work besides the periods of time in which hunters are allowed into the forest in order to, call the herd and also provide the resources for conservation, which is really where Texas, at least conservation money, comes from hunting in a lot of ways. So it's a really, what we were trying to do, and I think what is critical is at least try to reveal all of that craziness, the patchwork that kind of overlays all of these spaces that you could go on a hike one day and camp, but at the same time there's oil being, withdrawn from the land, and then it becomes a CLT building the next day, and then someone's hunting on it the day after that, and it's all happening in the same place, which to me is just the perfect encapsulation of our condition. So that's what kind of drew us there.
And what's really interesting, and I'm sure you know this, but so many of the histories of environmental conservation, especially in the American context, but also through kind of other histories like in the Charter of the Forest, they are about protecting the forest for extraction, right, of timber, but also of the deer hunt, right, which was the forests were traditionally protected for royals and aristocrats to hunt deer. And so what's interesting is that history is even how it's translated into the kind of American conservation movement. Hunters were often some of the leaders of these kind of types of environmental stewardship for the preservation of land and fauna to hunt, right, to extract from, right? And so I think it's very interesting, the kind of, again, these sort of histories of conservation are not these kind of innocent spaces of ecological care and preservation, but they are also part of these regimes of extraction that have kind of persisted in the forest for centuries.
Isn't it in The Dawn of Everything where they talk about how the colonists, because a lot of the colonial accounts of Native Americans talked about how men didn't do anything, and it sounds like a really negative account, but I think in Dawn of Everything they argue that actually that has to do with the fact that the men hunted, and so that was associated with an aristocratic class that didn't work. They were like, oh, the men don't do anything, they just are hunting, so they're like not
just enjoying their
surplus. They're just like yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, there was one question for you.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, Peggy, you're dropping that.
Oh,
Thank you.
And I have two questions. They are kind of connected. I was looking at your housing typologies, but now I'm also stuck on this image. And I see, but I want to know from you, some connections with the Italian radicals. Archizum. This could be a small, if we remove the chairs, we remove the tent, it would be a small piece of the Monumento Continuo, the forest that is crossing, just a section. So I'd like to know if that moment has an influence in your work and why. And second question, going back to the housing typologies, I found that work really interesting. And I was curious if you ever experimented with the recreation of these typologies, mixing them, forming different urban structures from the sprawl. I mean, we know the sprawl is the main cause of the pollution, of the lack of identity of the American city. So have you ever investigated in that direction? Because here is a lot of beautiful fragments, but they are fragments. So I was wondering if your work is also about that.
I mean, just the first question, I think the Italian radicals and
Definitely.
Archizum is I actually really
This was my quote.
that was the comment.
Okay, cool.
I like that reading a lot.
Yeah.
Of this. I like the kind of continuous, or the continuous monument in the forest that is radically open instead of kind of enclosing the world
terrifying
interior.
Yeah.
I like that as a kind of counter project, or at least a continuation. I think. I mean, do you want to take the second one? Or,
Well, yeah.
it's a hard question.
I think the question or the model homes project was maybe limited in its scope because it was really working with kind of tweaking the developer catalog to produce these new types. And we started to get to the kind of urban aggregation in the kind of combinatoric plans. But I think and so, I mean, it stayed quite abstract for sure, but I think that there is this sort of a next project in the model homes that, work where it would become this sort of thinking not as just this kind of like new landscape of suburban types, but instead as ways that we could insert that into the kind of existing landscape and create these like strange patches that that are kind of maybe embedded in the ladders of suburbia, but kind of have these radically different forms of life. And actually, what I'm describing is really what Houston is. I don't know, have you been to Houston? Because Houston is this kind of crazy city where, as you probably know, there is no zoning, but what that's done is produce this kind of incredibly fragmented landscape where you can have skyscrapers next to single family homes, next to highway, and you know, those next to highways, next to zoos, next to vacant lots full of horses, next to factories, right? And that's all in one like residential area. And so there's something kind of so terrifying but really provocative in Houston as this kind of frame, as this patchwork that actually suggests ways of maybe countering the kind of homogenous sprawl of a suburb, and instead kind of figuring out ways that we can start inserting these alternative architectures into a landscape. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, you should go to Houston.
I mean, about something you didn't show, so I mean,
Yeah.
But it's yes, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, larger scale,
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely something we think about. But part of the issue is that we're confronting these conditions, existing kind of ubiquitous sprawling landscapes that do form still, at least in Houston, the core of the city. It's still the urban core is that condition. Very different from here, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think that, so part of this kind of increment or thinking about a transition, I think is really provocative in that space, just because that's the sort of mentality and mindset that needs to sort of change at a large scale in our culture. So I don't know, that's why it becomes kind of an interesting space to operate, because if you say, let's live in Hilbersheimer's, city, people don't want to. We would, but maybe we try.
Okay, Ted, you're next.
I was also going to ask about the Italian modernist question, but Italian radical question. But I think I was especially interested in the homes at the beginning, in the way that you were talking about this open-ended system, this sort of recombinant idea. But I think the kind of underlying thread through all of the projects is an interesting formal one too. And in particular with, and maybe to Lisa's point about the rooms at the beginning, there's also clearly some interest in, there's like a Palladian thing happening.
There's no tartan though.
To another Italian, but I think what it really made me question is be interested in that is how you think about the promise of an open-ended system and its limit when it starts taking on form, right? Because in the case of those open-ended room plans, you talk about them being of 5 bedrooms, but like one bedroom has no windows, right? One bedroom is a corner, right? So they immediately gain hierarchy the moment they're in these configurations. So there's a really interesting kind of trade-off between the promise of the axon, maybe, of something that's endless or perspectiveless or equal-sized rooms, and the trap of having to make one configuration, basically to choose one as opposed to the 183 or however many there are, right? And when there is one, the rooms aren't the same anymore. So how do you kind of think about that question?
That's a really good question.
I mean, I think that it's funny, the openness of the system and its confrontation with the form that you're talking about, like, yes, when you imagine a singular one of these, it's like when you kind of pin down the electron. And you have to,
That's exactly
right.
That's the problem.
And so I think in that project, was an act of will, I think, to resist trying to image, trying to kind of create, imagine a specific way of life beyond the slightly humorous but descriptive title of each of those, and that really that forced us into thinking about the kind of the multiplicity of difference. And it's not really a kind of, I mean, I guess you could call it an open system in that, but it is still a contained set, right? And so it could, in theory, become infinite, but part of it was that each one was authored. And so even within that kind of limitation of authoring 138 individual specific kind of combinatorial agents that could then begin to move, form played a role, right? Like, and so I don't know, maybe you have a better answer.
And no, I think it's an amazing question, because there are like, when does, like, some forms are more amenable than others to open systems, right? So some, I think, forms are inherently containers, like like typological containers that produce limits, while some forms are inherently like interchangeable and have a kind of underlying logic that can expand. And so maybe to answer your question, what becomes a kind of limit of form is actually when the kind of idea of property comes into, or property or edge or plat or street comes into the question, where that becomes, so it can't just be a kind of an endless interior, a kind of expanding monument, but it has to confront the kind of mechanisms of property and through its form or through its aggregations maybe overcome them. But so maybe it's, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but I think it's interesting to think about open-ended systems, not only how they confront issues of form, but also how those formal logics have to confront issues of property, right? Because those are kind of, there's a sort of a typological architectural dimension, and then there's the kind of the logics of land or of real property they're always sort of enmeshed. So I don't know, maybe that's a way of looking at it or answer. I don't, your question was smarter than my answer.
Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting point that raises is like, it's not just that it needs edges, because you're right, that when it has edges, it has to have a figure. But in many cases, you chose like a symmetrical figure when it could have had nothing, right? So I'm kind of interested in what that draw was to have those secondary orders when the kind of promise of the informal was very close, actually, right? But maybe wasn't as poignant to you somehow without the kind of clarity of that figure.
It's probably because we were indoctrinated by Palladio. I don't know if I'm our schoolmate is this way.
But also, your intention wasn't necessarily to create a system with no hierarchy, right? Because, I mean, the idea of the subject, I think, is just as important there, right? And so, like, once you start introducing the idea of subjectivity, then it's not about hierarchy. Like, you are trying to create difference within that space, which is why you have I want a space that's separate for sleeping, or I want to, and so, like, the capacity for the thing to create difference is just as important as its capacity to perform.
Yeah, it's not like a flat. Some of them are flat ontologically, but some are structured and have kind of axes and kind of more powerful configurations, right? If that, or like figural configurations. But
it's also hard because they're not designed to be read as plans, in a way, right? They are designed to be. Right? The organizational charts are illegible. If you look at them, right? So everything kind of stands in for, but so there's a wall, there's a bed, there's an edge, but really I think that the organizational chart is kind of the open system, maybe more real,
more open,
thing that kind of, I don't know, masquerades as a plan.
Okay, we still have questions. I think Nora was next.
Hi, thank you. My question is about your practice as a whole and the aspirations of these projects. And if there is a kind of, because it feels like there are sort of sets of protocols that you're developing as a practice that come back in the different projects. I particularly enjoyed the material acknowledgements, and I wonder how that can come back in different ways in the project. And I also wonder, you mentioned here and there, collaborators. So I wondered, like, what if there are aspirations that for for the aspirations for the projects as a body of work, that kind of cut across in terms of the alliances they can build, the spaces they can interfere in. I think you also mentioned their pedagogical ambitions, and also how they're born. Like if there's a sort of protocol that you've developed with that. Like I'm interested in sort of in the way that this is developing, but also in where you'd like to take this.
I mean, that's a great question. I think a lot of it is limited by the constraints of the sort of space of exhibition that we have at that moment, but also the desire to kind of try to reach different audiences and begin to form alliances with different groups. But at the same time, that's work that's ongoing. So a lot of it is still kind of part of the next steps of each project. And I think a lot of it is a kind of continuity from one to the next. I think the first two projects really are sort of one, and then the two palms and the field station, and the next thing that we're working on, which is really working with some of these scientists and researchers in these contested sort of landscapes, which we're going to keep working on this coming year. I think that those are relationships that are just also difficult to build in a way, because they are, it's difficult to talk to a director of a field station about a proposal for a hypothetical speculative field station that they don't have the resources to produce, even though they are very interested in building other things in and around their environment. But so we're having the conversations, and they're really interesting and exciting. But I think that that's part of the confrontation, where it's how do we structure a logic of work that then, yeah, exactly right. How do we start broadening those relationships and points of contact?
Yeah, and it's something that we're just like, it's ongoing work. It's developing. Like a lot of our practice and our teaching experience has been like under COVID, and so we're like, as we emerge out of the fogs of the pandemic, it's becoming a lot like easier to work with others, to go to site visits, because our work is also very sort of site related, right? And so it's been really nice kind of finding these opportunities for co-learning and kind of thinking through these projects and working with maybe not just architects, but trying to work with people who are like kind of on the ground doing this ecological research. So it's really kind of, I think what you said is the aspiration of the work and of the practice is not it's very important us to kind of have a relationship to architectural pedagogy, but the aspiration is maybe kind of using these projects and that are adjacent to architecture, but start maybe relating to other fields as a kind of an opportunity to think about, like, I know the word interdisciplinarity is so like hackneyed, but an idea of looking at architecture, not just architecture as itself, but as something that has to be related to these kind of other disciplines, other subjectivities, other forms of life. And I think that that's really the kind of aspiration. Yeah.
Nicholas?
I guess along the same line of the question, do you actually want to build a field station for a few of these 138 houses, or do you prefer them as speculative projects?
I think we have different answers.
No, I mean, I think that the projects would be completely different in that context, right? Like, would I want to build this exactly as it stands? No, it would be a very different world if the kind of realities and specificities of a soil condition that we're looking at in a different part of the Sam Houston Forest actually brought to bear on the architecture itself. For the model homes, then we're talking about a space that has, a particular client who has desires, right? So I think that architecture has to give a little in those contexts. And so right now, as these projects were conceived and worked through, no, I wouldn't really be interested in bringing them into the light of day in that form, but they would change if they did, right? That may be a lame answer, but yeah.
Oh, well, actually, I thought you were going to answer something different. But I think that it's interesting that you said that. I think that we would definitely be interested in kind of in producing these and kind of maybe building a field station, making one of these strange sci-fi greenhouse futures. But at the same time, I think it's it's important to also confront our own labor condition. Like we're full-time teachers, we have, like I think there's a moment where all of a sudden you're working with clients and your practice scales up, that it really kind of changes the kind of the possibilities and flexibilities of working in a more sort of speculative, pedagogical, and exhibition-based projects. So I think that it would be really interesting to kind of actually pursue these and to build them, but it would kind of require a completely, it would just be a radically different practice, right? I think in that way. And so I think we're open to the idea, but also we're also just sort of figuring things out. And so I think we're really enjoying more of a hybrid practice that works through writing and through representation and through kind of these pedagogical exhibition models. But I think we wouldn't close down that opportunity. Yeah. I don't know if that's a good answer, Nick.
I think we have time for one last question, and then we have to close things down. I saw one last hand. Yeah. Oh, cool.
Tania?
Pardon?
She's
Oh.
calling to the Zoom sphere.
Glowing, blinking object on the table.
Oh.
Hopefully it'll work.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, DJ and Brittany. It's Tanya. Okay, so I'm gonna read my question. So thanks for a fascinating talk, as always. Your research and analysis convincingly present architectural experiments of the most diverse scales to invite environmentally and socially aware engagements with our urban and natural environments, or invite reflection on that. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the role of your proposed designs as mediators between landscapes and bodies. Is there a similar way in which the projects of different scales address this relationship?
Oh, sorry, you're breaking up.
Landscapes and?
Oh no, where did I break up?
At
Landscapes.
Mediating role between landscapes and ...
Bodies, okay, and bodies. So I was wondering if you could elaborate
Bodies,
more
okay.
on the role of your proposed designs as mediators between landscapes and bodies. Is there a similar way in which the projects of different scales address this relationship? Maybe are you considering architecture as an infrastructure driving the transition from the occupation and exploitation of natural resources to a more respectful insertion of our livelihoods into existing natural systems? So how do bodies weaving their way in and out of these proposed architectures relate to the cradling landscapes? I know that was very long.
That was a beautiful question. I think it's, you know, I think that in our work, in almost all of our kind of designs and representations, we actually do not show bodies except for the kind of image that's on. This is maybe for home office. This is the only project, or this is the only image we've done with people in it, and it's because I think for us, we're very interested in the ways that architecture mediates not just environments but bodies in landscapes, but like by representing them, often it really kind of forecloses the sort of many types of subjects, both human and non-human, that could possibly kind of appear and live in these landscapes. And so I think that it's one of those projects where maybe it's much more implicit, the kind of the role of the body, of the human body, as well as kind of non-human bodies in the architecture. But it's definitely something that we're hoping is maybe coming out in the project. Maybe you want to answer.
I mean, also we are really interested in how these conditions of the active maintenance, care, labor that goes along with the tending and of these spaces occurs. So even like with the Palm House project, when we were talking to the gardeners about the number of hours that they kind of clean the leaves of the palm year and the specific kind of physical conditions of those types of maintenance, I think that does capture our interest, and we try to represent it in other ways other than sort of like, you know, you could see a video of people, you know, tending, right? And that changes completely the way that you read a landscape, because it shows the duration of time to do ecological care at the scale of a forest, which is, or at the scale of a leaf of a palm. But like the field stations really do, that's part of their reason to exist is to maintain large landscapes for biodiversity and abundance so that more experiments can happen there. So they could draw scientists and researchers. So that kind of care is incredibly detailed and intense, right? And so it is really interesting, its relationship to the body.
And I think that also, you know, so often as architects, we think about bodies in space, but what's really interesting about the field station is that it's much more about bodies in time. And so a really kind of central component of field station research is this idea of multi-generational data gathering. And so all of a sudden it kind of flips a switch where you're not thinking about humans occupying an environment, but instead you're thinking about kind of these bodies that kind of coexist in these different timescales, kind of returning over and over again to a landscape to understand it, to observe it, to and to care for it. And so I think, to me, this idea of a body through time rather than a body in space is also kind of a really powerful way to think about how architecture can mediate these landscapes.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I think that's all we have time for.
All right, cool.
So
Awesome.
we should wrap up, but
Thank you guys.
thank you
so much.
both so much.
Fun.